Welcome to my fourth episode of this live stream series. So this week I'm going to be talking about two Russian composers, Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. And what's interesting about Russian composers in general is that it's very similar to American composers in that they were both very isolated from Western Europe and from the musical traditions in Germany, Italy, France, and even England. So just geographically, they were very isolated, and so they didn't have necessarily access to everything that was going on. There was a lot of transfer of information and musical styles between these countries in Europe, but Russia was not necessarily a part of that. That started to change with Peter the Great and Russia's kind of opening up towards the West and to Western influence. So the first real composer that you can speak of in the Western tradition is Mikhail Glinka, who's considered the father of Russian music. But Glinka didn't study in Russia. He went to Italy and France and studied with composers that were Western European. And so then he brought back those traditions to Russia and wrote opera. But ils entendent pas? More sound. All right, hopefully that's a little better. I'll try to speak more closely. All right, that should be a little bit better. All right, so where was I? Yeah, Russia. So Glinka brought back these European traditions and then adapted them to Russian stories, taking epic poems of Pushkin, for example, and setting them to operas. So we have the emergence of this Russian style, of Russianness, of a kind of nationalistic style, but that really was just based on a European style. I mean, if you're writing opera and sonatas and symphonies, you're writing Western European music, which until then really wasn't very Russian. And then the next really important figure is Tchaikovsky, probably the most important figure in Russian music. And he kind of took off where Glinka left off. The difference, though, is that Tchaikovsky studied in Russia. So he really was, although of course influenced by Western styles, he studied in Russia, and he was kind of a homegrown composer, let's say. And he is also known as the first professional composer in Russia, meaning that he made a living composing. That wasn't at first, though. At first, he came from a wealthy military family, and he started off at a jurisprudence school, so kind of like a law school in St. Petersburg. Then when he graduated, he worked for the Ministry of Justice, but he was always writing music and very involved with the musical community. So he was born in 1840 and died in 1893. And in 1862, his composition teacher, Anton Rubinstein, opened the St. Petersburg Conservatory. So taking this German model of conservatory education and bringing it to Russia. The difference, though, is now the classes would be in Russian, which was something that was very new for the time. Usually, at that level of society, everyone spoke French rather than Russian. So this really legitimized musicians in Russia and gave them a place in society that wasn't necessarily there before. Then after his studies in St. Petersburg, he went to Moscow in 1866 and was hired at the Moscow Conservatory that was newly opened by Anton Rubinstein's brother, Nikolai Rubinstein. So this was kind of the Western-leaning side of Russia. You had really these two groups, kind of the Slavic focused, who really wanted to isolate Russia and to stay true to its nature, and then the Western leaning groups. These conservatory musicians were definitely part of the Western leaning musicians, and this divide still, in a sense, exists to this day. So Tchaikovsky was celebrated in his lifetime as really the great Russian composer, a symbol of Russian music during his lifetime and then, of course, afterwards, but also internationally. So he received an honorary doctorate from Cambridge. He toured the United States, went to New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, playing concerts. He opened Carnegie Hall. So in 1891, the first week of concerts for the opening of Carnegie Hall, which wasn't yet called Carnegie Hall, he performed and conducted his works. On the program, it was written the three great living composers, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Saint-Saëns. So Tchaikovsky was a national hero already during his lifetime. Now, what's very interesting, he then died of cholera just a few years later. What's interesting about Tchaikovsky and about a lot of composers and different people in history is the way in which we interpret their lives after their death. So with Tchaikovsky, it's an interesting case to see how different political regimes in Russia would portray him in different ways. What occurred was that Tchaikovsky wrote a tremendous amount of letters, and he had diaries where he really goes deep into his personal life. And the Russians wanted to keep him as a specific symbol of Russian nationalism, and they didn't want that to be tainted by anything that might have been found in those diaries. So a lot of his letters were sealed in the archives and censored. So the main thing was that Tchaikovsky was gay, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. Now we have access to all of his letters, and he talks about it very openly and very freely. But already during his lifetime, there were rumors, and it was something that was known. But after his death, it was the Russian government really made an effort all the way until, even recently, to hide this fact from the world and to portray him as they thought he should be portrayed. Even now, the official party line with Putin and the director of culture is, yes, we know he was gay, but let's not worry about that. We're just going to focus on his music. It's almost like in spite of, So it's really something that they don't want to focus on. But the issue is that because it was hidden for so long, there were many kind of conspiracy theories surrounding it, particularly his death, whether it was suicide, whether there was some foul play. So this is something really that's had to be corrected even just recently as we look through his letters and see what the reality was of his life. Was he tormented by this, or was he actually very open about it? The reality, too, is that in Russia at the time, serfdom had just been abolished in 1861. So it was much later than the European countries, a few years before the United States, but still, this was a very hierarchical society. If you were part of the elites, like Tchaikovsky was, your sexual preference and the things you did that maybe weren't condoned were not so much of an issue. Of course, if you were a peasant or a laborer, those things might be a problem. But when you're in these higher classes, it just wasn't as much of an issue as some musicologists try to portray it, trying to create a connection between that and then some perceived suffering in his music. So then that's connected with his death. Tchaikovsky died of cholera, which was a very common disease at the time, but it was associated with poorer classes because it was directly connected to the drinking water and to food preparation. So poor neighborhoods had bad hygiene, and so the chances of getting a bacteria that would lead to cholera was much greater, and it was kind of generally seen. Why would Tchaikovsky get this? Did he get it on purpose? Was he kind of forced in some way? In any case, he died quite suddenly of cholera, and it was a huge shock for the entire nation and for the musical community. Specifically, his piano music, so his B-flat, his first piano concerto, is really his great work for piano. It's played every season in every country over the world. It's really an incredibly well-known work. Every pianist plays this at some point in their life. But he also wrote music for solo piano. There's a G major piano sonata that in the West absolutely no one plays. It's really something that Russian pianists continue to play. It's a huge work, incredibly challenging, but for whatever reason it hasn't really caught on in the West. But what has caught on are these smaller pieces. Tchaikovsky wrote many small pieces in the vein of Chopin and Schumann, mainly for domestic use, so for amateur music making, things like that. Often these were commissions. Probably the most famous of that group are the seasons. So 12 pieces, each one representing 1 month of the year. These were written in around 1875, around the same time that the first piano concerto was written, and they were a commission from a Russian magazine journal that each month they would publish one of these pieces written by Tchaikovsky. So he agreed to that for a very high fee, and so we have then now this collection of 12 pieces. They're relatively approachable. Some use it for teaching material, but they all have a very distinct character. The two I've chosen, the June Barcarolle and October, are very lyrical and melancholic, very, very beautiful. So I'll be playing those two from the seasons, and then a nocturne from the Opus 19 set of 6 pieces. These were also a commission. This nocturne was written about 2 years before the seasons. It's very reminiscent of Chopin. Again, very lyrical, very beautiful, somewhat sentimental, but really a lovely piece. And he transcribed it for cello and orchestra. Some people might know it in that version. All right, so starting with Tchaikovsky, 2 pieces from the seasons, June Barcarolle. Oh, and briefly, a barcarolle is basically a Venetian gondolier song. So Mendelssohn wrote them. There's the famous Chopin barcarolle as well. It always has a feeling of the water underneath, and then a lyrical line above, kind of imitating the Venetian gondolier. So June Barcarolle, October, and then the nocturne from Opus 19. So 3 pieces by Tchaikovsky. Okay. Now moving on to Rachmaninoff. So Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky knew each other. Rachmaninoff was only 20 years old when Tchaikovsky died. They knew each other at the Moscow Conservatory, where Rachmaninoff was a student. So although Tchaikovsky was no longer teaching there when Rachmaninoff was a student, he was still very involved with examinations and with kind of overseeing various things. He already heard him as a 16-year-old boy and recognized the incredible talent and promise for the future. And at the premiere of Tchaikovsky's ballet, The Nutcracker, he was interviewed, and they asked him how he imagined his future. Obviously, he didn't know he was going to die the next year, but he was saying things along the lines of, in the next 5 years, I think I'll keep composing, and then eventually, once the inspiration runs out, I'll leave the place for younger composers. And they asked him to name a few. He named Glazunov from St. Petersburg, and then Rachmaninoff and Arensky in Moscow. So Tchaikovsky kind of set Rachmaninoff up as his spiritual heir, musical heir. And this was known to Rachmaninoff and known to all of Russia. When Tchaikovsky died, Rachmaninoff wrote a trio, the second piano trio dedicated to him. Similarly, Tchaikovsky, when Nikolai Rubinstein died, he wrote his piano trio dedicated to Nikolai, so kind of continuing in that tradition. Rachmaninoff had wonderful things to say about Tchaikovsky, that he was incredibly generous and gracious, and that the only man that he met that even came close to his stature was Anton Chekhov. So really considered him an incredible musician and person, and I think was very encouraged by Tchaikovsky, and Rachmaninoff needed encouragement. So Rachmaninoff famously is kind of the anti-modernist. So lived most of his life in the 20th century, but his music is romantic. So for Rachmaninoff, what was important to him was that the composer was able to express his inner life, his love affairs, the books he read, the paintings he saw, that what came out in his music was a representation of his soul, and communicating that to the audience. So a very romantic vision. He was very much against any sort of procedural, compositional, kind of 12-tone system, anything like that. He was very, very much against. He believed that music should come from this kind of personal inspiration, and he didn't try to be to create music of the future. I mean, that was very much a Wagnerian and a Lisztian idea of writing music to continue music that progresses the art form, that keeps it moving forward somehow. Even so much as to say, then in the 20th century, composers saying, we don't care about what the public thinks about our music. We're not writing it for you. So they kind of took that opposite direction. Rachmaninoff is not at all in that. He is the opposite in that the music he writes, it's really for now, meaning because he was performing it. He was out there touring day in, day out, playing endless piano recitals, and often with his own music. So he had this direct connection with the public. There's a story that he told to Nikolai Medtner in a letter where he's talking about the Corelli variations, and it's a series of 20 variations on a theme, La Folia. And he says he depending on coughing in the audience, he adjusts the number of variations he plays. If people seem agitated, he'll play only 10 of the variations, saying that now his record's up to 18 in DC, I think it was. So that he's very aware of the reaction of the public to his music. We're very far from this idea of like Beethoven, far off in his isolated space, composing and then kind of presenting to the public, and whether they like it or not doesn't really matter. He has a much higher goal. For Rachmaninoff, of course, he had a goal. It was his personal expression, and to play things he liked, and play things and write things that the audience liked as well. So it was very much in that sense. Of course, with pianists, there's no issue. I mean, pianists love playing Rachmaninoff because it's written really for the piano so well. Rachmaninoff was one of the great pianists of the 20th century, and there are recordings that he made that are incredible. So for us, there's no doubt at his genius, but in an academic setting, in conservatories, universities particularly, he's often considered as a lesser composer. I remember once even asking a teacher, "Who's your least favorite composer?" And they said Rachmaninoff. So it's the anti-academic composer by definition, which is unfortunate because he's loved by the public. He's one of the most performed composers, and yet for whatever reason, it's because of this modernist issue here. And people have chosen two camps. So either you like Stravinsky or you like Rachmaninoff, or at least that's the way it was. So just a few quick biographical things about Rachmaninoff. One of the big events in his life, so he was born in 1873, and in 1897 he had the big premiere of his first symphony conducted by Glazunov, and it was an absolute disaster. It got terrible reviews. Glazunov was a terrible conductor. He was apparently totally drunk, and it was just a mess. And it was so painful for Rachmaninoff that he really went into a creative lapse. He couldn't write any music. He was totally blocked. So he conducted and he performed, but he wasn't able to write any music. He was so pained by that failure. He eventually started seeing a physician, Nikolai Dahl, and he was a psychologist and a hypnotherapist. And they started working together, and Rachmaninoff emerged from this as kind of being cured, and he found his motivation again. The product of that was his second piano concerto, written around 1900, 1901, and it's dedicated to Nikolai Dahl, his doctor. It's around that same time that he wrote the first set of preludes, Opus 23, two of which you'll hear tonight. Then, soon after that, he got married to his first cousin. They had to get married outside of Moscow in a kind of military wedding because the Tsar had forbid weddings between first cousins. And as a gift from his wife's family, they were given a house in Ivanovka, which is kind of in the suburbs, I guess, of Moscow. And this became kind of his favorite place to compose. Rachmaninoff really needed peace and quiet and calm in order to write music. So this was his favorite place in the countryside where he would get a lot of work done. So Rachmaninoff had a very, very successful career as a conductor, as a pianist. He came to the US in 1909 for a big tour with his newly completed third piano concerto. That's also around the time he wrote that second book of preludes that you'll hear one of tonight, the Opus 32 set. But he really didn't like the US and was very happy back in Russia. Unfortunately, things were changing politically that weren't really in his favor. Rachmaninoff, like Tchaikovsky, was an upper class person, maybe even more so than Tchaikovsky. Kind of his wife really was an aristocrat. And so he started feeling in 1916 already that revolution was coming, that there was a lot of agitation. And so he had an opportunity to play in Sweden and in Denmark, and he brought his entire family and they fled Russia soon after his home in Ivanovka was completely destroyed. The entire area was just destroyed by the Bolsheviks, by the revolutionaries. It's now been rebuilt, and it's a museum of Rachmaninoff's life. So he left, and he really left everything behind. So he had to provide for his family by playing concerts. And so this kind of started this endless touring to make a living. Eventually, he came to the United States, first in New York. But between 1917 and his death in 1943, he only wrote 6 original works. So most of the music of Rachmaninoff that you hear is really from his earlier period before he left Russia. There are just very few works. There's some transcriptions that he did as well in that period, but the main reason is most likely that he was just so busy. I mean, if you remember, he really likes calm and peaceful. He needs that to be able to write. and he just didn't have that because of his touring schedule. So he played all over the world. He eventually moved to Beverly Hills, but just very briefly before his death on it was doctor's recommendations, come for the weather. And he lived close to Horowitz, and Vladimir Horowitz, played his third piano concerto famously, and Rachmaninoff said, "I couldn't imagine to hear it so perfectly played in my lifetime." So even kind of admitting that Horowitz played it, I don't know whether it was better, but it was kind of the image, the perfect image of what he had in mind. And he died of an undiagnosed melanoma in Beverly Hills in 1943. So I'm going to be playing 3 preludes, 2 from that first set. The preludes are kind of interesting. They're a total of 24, so similar to Chopin and similar to Bach, of course, but they're not organized in that same way. And when he began writing preludes, the C-sharp minor prelude, when he was very young, right when he graduated the conservatory, he had no intention of writing a full set of 24. He wrote that first one, and then he wrote a series of 10 around 1901. You'll hear the D major, number 4, and the G minor, number 5 from that. And then 10 years later, the Opus 32, which has 13. So by the time he's writing the Opus 32, I think he realized, I'd like to do a set of 24, but it's only around that time. These are very much, they're character pieces. They have all of the typical romantic, typical Rachmaninoff stuff that we love, the luscious harmonies, the endless melodies, the broad lyricism. It's really wonderful music to play, and wonderful, I think, for the audience as well. All right, so the first 2 from the first book, around 1901, D major, number 4, very lyrical. Number 5, the famous G minor, the march, kind of heroic. And then the last one is the G sharp minor from the Opus 32. All right.